A person becomes lonely if they know more than others. This quote by Carl Jung opens up a vast horizon for understanding humanity's true struggle in confronting knowledge. These words are not merely a reflection on the relationship between the individual and society, but rather an explicit expression of the tragedy of human existence itself, where a person who transcends the boundaries of common knowledge collides with an inevitable wall of isolation. Jung, who saw in the collective unconscious a force that unites humans in their cultural and psychological heritage, expresses here the tension between individual understanding and collective isolation. A person who crosses the boundaries of the community into unfamiliar knowledge has no choice but to walk the path of deep understanding that others cannot keep up with. What Jung presents in this quote is what we might call the burden of understanding. The deeper an individual delves into knowledge, the wider the gap grows between them and others. This gap is not limited to the boundaries of the mind alone, but extends to include the social and cultural values that determine how individuals interact with each other. When someone carries within themselves truths that others cannot imagine, these truths begin to create an invisible barrier between them and the world around them. It's as if this person discovers a hidden world while those around them remain stuck in the apparent world. At this moment, the person unique in their knowledge becomes a stranger in their own homeland, where their pursuit of truth drives them into forced isolation. In this isolation, a deep internal struggle manifests, the conflict between humans' quest for understanding and their fundamental need for social belonging. As Jung suggests, when a person possesses advanced consciousness, they find themselves confronting the shadow, that dark side of themselves that contains the repressed aspects of their psychic life. Deep knowledge often means facing harsh truths that lead to inner isolation, just as the hero in existential literature faces their own challenges before the exhausting truth of their existence. On an existential level, Jung's quote, "A person becomes lonely if they know more than others," reflects the crisis of the individual in societies that don't accept difference, or rather, fail to comprehend the complexities of truth beyond the familiar. A person who possesses deeper awareness of their surroundings and understands truths that the collective mind cannot grasp finds themselves trapped between community demands and their desire for liberation from its constraints. The dilemma lies in that this knowledge doesn't open horizons of mutual understanding, but rather forces them into isolation, where they become rejected or misunderstood by those who cannot perceive beyond the apparent. They exist in a state oscillating between trying to understand deep truth and challenging societal standards that impose a narrow vision of the world. This existential isolation embodies the internal torn between uniqueness, which accompanies deep understanding, and the innate need for social belonging. The deeper an individual's capacity for understanding grows, the more distant they become, because deeper understanding cannot align with familiar societal traditions or concepts that often rest upon inherited ignorance or profound ignorance. This individual remains in constant internal conflict between awareness of their unique existence and their aspiration for harmony with others. Instead of their knowledge being a bridge for communication, it becomes a barrier that separates them from everyone. This tension between uniqueness and isolation is evident in works like The Devils by Dostoevsky, where the writer reflects the suffering of heroes who cross moral and social boundaries. In the novel, characters who seek to transcend traditional concepts of good and evil find themselves in a bitter internal battle. When they cross these boundaries, they discover they have separated themselves from a social reality that cannot bear their extreme ideas. This existential torn appears starkly in the character of Pyotr, who seeks to revolt against familiar values only to find himself ultimately isolated from everyone, and sometimes even in conflict with himself. This separation isn't merely a conflict with society, but with values he believed represented his shared truth. This condition that these heroes suffer from isn't just an individual case. but rather a symptom of the human condition experienced by every thinker, creator, or revolutionary who transcends familiar frameworks. A creator who seeks to present a new understanding of life, or a researcher who opens doors that society hasn't yet dared to open, finds themselves in a place resembling forced isolation, an isolation more bitter than social solitude because it becomes a reflection of a deeper conflict between personal truth and collective reality, between a self that refuses mental stagnation and a society that insists on remaining in a state of cognitive and existential stability. This isolation that the individual faces isn't just social alienation, but rather a spiritual and mental separation from their surroundings. In this context, the individual exists in a state of constant contradiction between their attempts to reach truth and the difficulty of communicating with those who remain in cognitive darkness. The more knowledge increases, the greater the distance grows between them and others, until they ultimately discover that knowledge isn't just a tool for communication, but sometimes another source of unbearable isolation. This existential tension between uniqueness, knowledge, and isolation also allows us to see the deep gap between humans and their fellow humans, which can be seen in existential literature and philosophical works dealing with subjectivity and existence. Deep understanding in this context doesn't just grant the individual the ability to analyze and examine, but also drowns them in a sea of existential isolation that may be more cruel than any social solitude. From a psychological perspective, Jung's quote emerges as a deep connection between cognitive awareness and psychological isolation, which we can link to Jung's own concept of the shadow in the human psyche. The shadow is that part of the self that remains hidden in the unconscious and contains feelings, thoughts, and motivations that we refuse to acknowledge or that we repress within ourselves. In the case of a person who is more aware than others, this process of awareness brings with it a confrontation with these internal shadows. As self-awareness and deep thinking increase, the person must face dark aspects of themselves that were previously hidden beneath the surface of consciousness, aspects that society or the surrounding culture cannot accept. This confrontation with the shadow can be painful, as the individual may find themselves in a state of alienation from both themselves and those around them. Knowledge in this context becomes a double-edged sword. On one hand, it is a means of liberation from ignorance and enables the person to understand themselves and the world around them more deeply. But on the other hand, this knowledge also becomes the path to revealing aspects that were hidden in the psyche. This may lead to a deep internal conflict. This internal conflict between consciousness and shadow parallels the philosophical concept presented by Friedrich Nietzsche in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he talks about the Übermensch, or Superman, who transcends traditional social and moral values to fully realize themselves. However, Nietzsche clarifies that this cognitive and intellectual superiority comes at the cost of isolating the person from society. Although knowledge grants power and the ability to influence, it may also lead to a person slipping into a state of isolation. This understanding of existence, filled with conflict between individual and society, is what makes the superior individual isolated in the eyes of others. In Martin Heidegger's philosophy, existence itself is viewed as a state of alienation. Heidegger, in his work Being and Time, indicates that humans, through their awareness of death and the limitations that characterize their existence, enter a state of existential isolation. When a person begins to grasp the deep truth about their existence, including the fatal understanding of time and space, they face a spiritual isolation manifested in existential anxiety. This deep awareness that reveals the fragility of existence pushes humans toward confronting the internal shadow that was initially unknown to them, further enhancing isolation. From another psychological perspective, we find that Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, spoke about the existence of these repressed aspects in the human psyche that form the larger part of the unconscious. When an individual becomes more self-aware, these repressed aspects begin to emerge, enhancing a sense of alienation. Freud believes that increasing consciousness exposes humans to an internal conflict between what is repressed in the unconscious and what society imposes in terms of controls and values, and this conflict can lead to psychological tension, contributing to growing internal isolation. Socially, Carl Jung's quote essentially reflects the deep disparity between individual and society regarding knowledge. In a world that maximizes collective conformity and cognitive superficiality, the person who possesses a deep understanding of existence is deprived of the ability to share this knowledge with others. Although society prefers the narrow horizon that isn't disturbed by any complexity, the individual who seeks to transcend this surface finds themselves in the position of a stranger whom no one understands. Here appears the tragedy of this individual in their feeling of constant isolation, as it becomes impossible for them to communicate with others who lack the intellectual tools necessary to understand their ideas. This disparity in knowledge creates an unbridgeable gap between deep individual consciousness and superficial collective consciousness, where truth becomes verifiable only within a limited circle of thinkers. This gap is reflected in the works of great philosophers like Spinoza, who in his book Ethics presents a vision of knowledge as a liberating force that can lead to individuality. For Spinoza, deep understanding of the world is equivalent to the pursuit of human perfection, but at the same time, it distances the individual from the group because knowing truth requires transcending popular beliefs and prevailing patterns in social thinking. Although Spinoza sees this knowledge as the only way to achieve true freedom, it simultaneously becomes a social burden that may lead to the isolation of the thinking person from society. A person's greater knowledge that transcends the boundaries of collective values may be a reason for their marginalization or misunderstanding by others. In the same context, we can find correspondence in Buddha's idea about deep consciousness and what the quote presents. In Buddha's teachings, we find that the person who achieves enlightenment and rises to understand the great truths about existence finds themselves in spiritual isolation from others. Although Buddha calls for communication with others and moving toward broad empathy, this deep spiritual journey toward nirvana may create a sense of alienation from a society immersed in its desires. The individual who reaches higher spiritual knowledge cannot simply express it to others because they don't possess sufficient awareness to understand this deep wisdom. On another level, in the basic concepts of metaphysics by German philosopher Martin Heidegger, we also find how modern humans reflect cognitive isolation from society due to their constant pursuit of a deeper understanding of existence. Heidegger sees that contemporary humans drown in preoccupation with daily existence and superficial thinking, creating a kind of spiritual and existential void. The person who is aware of their existence on a deeper level acquires additional suffering because they become a strange being among others who don't seek this awareness but limit their interests to daily or material matters. In literature, we find in Homer's Odyssey a similar image of social and cognitive alienation, where Odysseus suffers from constant isolation due to his deep and different experience from those who live in his homeland. Odysseus's journey isn't just a physical journey, but also an internal journey of knowledge that makes him disconnected from his world. Odysseus cannot share with others his suffering or deeper understanding of his existence, which reinforces his feeling of alienation and difference. From these philosophical and spiritual examples, it becomes clear that deep knowledge doesn't always come as a tool for communication or convergence, but often becomes a double-edged sword, leading its bearer to social isolation that may be more difficult than physical isolation. It opens up a broader horizon of understanding for humans, but it may pull them away from the society they live in. On the moral level, Carl Jung's quote raises fundamental questions about the relationship between knowledge and moral values. If knowledge gives the individual the ability to understand existence more deeply, what role does this knowledge play in human relationships? Should the individual bear the responsibility of this knowledge that may isolate them from others? Or should they remain within the bounds of traditional knowledge to maintain their communication with society? Can knowledge transform into a moral burden that puts the individual in internal conflict between self and society? From the perspective of moral philosophy, we find that Hegel in Elements of the Philosophy of Right provides an interpretation of the relationship between knowledge and social relations, where he sees that an individual who possesses knowledge surpassing other people falls into continuous conflict between their individuality and the necessity of belonging to the group. For Hegel, reason is embodied in the external world through social interaction, and accordingly, knowledge cannot be correct except when it finds correspondence with the group. If an individual carries knowledge higher than others, this may lead to a sharp contrast between themselves and the group, resulting in moral isolation. Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract expresses this moral tension differently. In his view, knowledge that doesn't stem from social consensus or that moves away from collective values may threaten the unity of society. Although Rousseau acknowledges the individual's right to critical thinking, he sees that an individual who exceeds society's boundaries in their thought may expose themselves to danger through social isolation. The gap between individual knowledge and collective knowledge weakens the bonds of solidarity, making the person who carries deeper knowledge unable to express themselves within the framework of shared social values. In existential philosophy, Martin Heidegger in his book Being and Time highlights the relationship between knowledge and the individual in facing social being. For Heidegger, knowledge doesn't only lead to superiority over others, but to human alienation from themselves and those around them. This moral alienation becomes more apparent in situations where deep understanding of things requires humans to live in a world characterized by superficiality. A person with high knowledge finds themselves in constant conflict between maintaining their self-identity and engaging in a social system that requires compliance with general principles. Émile Cioran adds another dimension to this moral issue in his book On the Heights of Despair. Cioran sees that knowledge, especially when it exceeds the boundaries of collective mind, becomes a main source of isolation. The more an individual becomes aware of their internal and external world, the more they feel a greater disparity between themselves and others. Knowledge makes them feel alienated because others don't possess the means to understand them, or even keep up with this continuous quest for knowledge. In this moral struggle, the individual becomes compelled to reconsider the true value of knowledge in their human relationships, and whether knowledge can remain a blessing if it leads to moral isolation. In literature, we find this issue clearly appearing in Thomas Mann's works in The Magic Mountain. In this novel, the main character Henry's struggle between his deep knowledge and isolation from society is embodied. The deeper he delves into understanding what lies beyond life and death, the more distant he becomes from everyone. This isolation doesn't come from his rejection of society, but from society's inability to understand what he knows. Thus, knowledge in the novel becomes like a moral constraint that makes Henry lose the ability to interact with others genuinely. Similarly, we find in Kafka's works like The Trial how knowledge can become a moral obstacle. In this novel, the protagonist Joseph finds himself facing a legal world dominated by ambiguity, and his feeling of isolation increases with every attempt to understand the laws that govern his existence. Joseph discovers that his knowledge of things happening around him doesn't grant him any real authority, but rather increases his alienation and isolation. Knowledge becomes in this case a tool of moral impotence, isolating him from understanding reality as others see it. Based on these philosophical and literary problems, we see that Jung's quote raises major ethical questions about the position of knowledge in an individual's life and how it can affect their relationships with others. In a cultural and civilizational context dominated by consumer cultures and superficiality, it becomes difficult to accept different ideas or absorb deep knowledge that exceeds prevailing standards. Societies that focus on consumer values often tend to restrict thought that challenges those values, leading to the consecration of superficiality and marginalization of those who seek to present knowledge of a deep humanitarian nature. In this context, we can find another example from Nietzsche's philosophy, who presented ideas analyzing the human condition and challenging religious and moral beliefs that had prevailed for long generations. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche shows the central character Zarathustra, who tries to convey ideas about the Superman to people, but faces rejection and ignorance from a society that sees in his ideas a threat to prevailing customs and traditions. Zarathustra, who calls for transcending traditional humanity and embracing independent individual existence, ultimately becomes an outcast living in severe isolation, as his ideas are interpreted as an attack on the values society was raised on. This social rejection of the idea of an individual who transcends tradition highlights the extent of society's resistance to any real intellectual change that might disturb the existing order. The individual who seeks to reveal deep truth, like Zarathustra, becomes a burden on a system that only seeks to maintain its apparent stability. This isolation isn't limited to literature or philosophy only, but finds extension in our contemporary reality, where thinkers and creators who present new ideas that might contradict popular beliefs face rejection and marginalization. For example, in the global societal arena, many thinkers and activists who criticize restrictive regimes or call for deep social change often face oppression and threats. Things become more complicated in societies dominated by commercial and cultural ideologies, where critical thought is only valued if it serves the economic interests of controlling classes. We find that popular culture often praises large institutions and consumerist appearances, while suppressing ideas that seek to present a deeper vision of existence and humanity. In this context, the thinker who doesn't align with this prevailing social current becomes alienated from society and suffers from isolation that carries within it a philosophical tragedy, similar to what Nietzsche showed in his ideas about the Superman and the society that cannot accept him. This marginalization of deep thought, whether in philosophy or in political and cultural reality, makes society more attached to its superficial beliefs and leads to depriving individuals of their right to express different ideas, creating a cultural environment incapable of intellectual and civilizational progress. In conclusion, Carl Jung's quote emerges as a deep window opening a horizon for contemplating the dialectic of knowledge and isolation, that which makes humans oscillate between the blessing of perception and the curse of separation. For knowledge is subjective in a world that fears facing itself. Perhaps this isolation that Jung spoke about isn't inherently a flaw, but rather an inevitable reflection of those who realize that the path to wisdom isn't crowded, but is an individual path taken by brave souls. Nevertheless, the greatest challenge remains reconciling the call of reason with the needs of the social spirit, between wisdom and emotion, and between staying connected to the world without sacrificing the purity of self. It's a call to reflect on the price of knowledge, not just as a tool for liberation, but as an existential price that imposes on its bearer to be a stranger in a familiar world and an individual in a society that seeks to blur the features of uniqueness. Finally, I salute you, companions of thought and friends. You are the ones who embark with me on the journey of contemplating the essence of humanity and the secret of existence. You are the ones who swim against the current of superficiality toward the depths of truth. As we turn the pages of this contemplation, I promise you a new meeting where we dive together into the mazes of thought and secrets of existence, where new issues await us worthy of deconstruction and analysis. Until we meet soon, where the word is a beacon and contemplation is a horizon that reshapes the features of existence.